Good afternoon, evening to us all. I suggest that we start. Our session is titled, "How has trust been established in post-conflict or past conflict resolution cases?" And I suggest that we have three speakers. I suggest that after a short introduction, each of them gives us a short 25 to 30 minutes presentation that will leave us with about 30 minutes discussion time towards the end. And at the end, I'll allow myself also to say a few words about the concept of trust very shortly. I would like first to introduce Professor Piotr Sztompka. He's professor of sociology and chair of theoretical sociology at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. His work includes many scholarly articles and books on two main issues. One of them is the issue of trust, about which he will talk with us today, and the other one is the issue of social change and the links between trust and social change. To give us a flavor of the kind of work that Professor Sztompka has been doing, I took out from the web, from the internet, two titles of his books. One of them titled Trust, a Sociological Theory, and the other one, a book titled From East Europeans to Europeans, Shifting Identities and Boundaries in the New Europe. Two main foci, one on trust and the other one on social change. His talk today will be on two theoretical approaches to trust, the implications for the resolution of intergroup conflict. Please.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, let me thank you for the invitation. It is my third trip to Israel. Two earlier ones were to Jerusalem and this one to Tel Aviv, so I'm getting more and more acquainted with Israeli sociological and scientific community. I had a person whom I admired very much in Israeli sociological community, Shmuel Eisenstadt, who has been in some sense also my teacher, not directly, but through his extremely important theoretical work on social change, on historical change, on the mechanisms of social movements and many other issues. My talk today will be focusing on theoretical issues, and I will attempt a theoretical explication of the problem of trust and distrust, particularly in the situation of intergroup conflict. I will not refer to any concrete conflict, but rather draw a conceptual map applicable to a variety of conflicts which may be used to concrete cases. I have my own philosophy or ideology of scholarship saying that there is nothing more important and more practical than theory, than having an understanding at a general level, and that's what I am trying to do. My main focus will be how trust and distrust is built in the interpersonal, but also in intergroup relations. And narrowing down this focus, I will try to discuss how trust can be rebuilt in the relation of distrust between individuals and groups. And the relation of distrust is a definitional quality of interpersonal or intergroup conflict. It's hard to conceive of a real conflict without distrust, even though it is not necessarily the other way around. It is possible also to think of trust which accompanies conflict at some level, which was mentioned earlier by Shlomo Avineri and other speakers today. There are two approaches which I refer to in the title of my presentations to this issue, two approaches to how trust is built and how distrust is built. And the first approach is history-rooted trust or distrust. Trust or distrust emerging as the result of long cumulative history of beneficial or harmful events or experiences in mutual relationships between people or between groups. History of peaceful, fruitful cooperation, or the opposite, history of mutual violence and wars. History of support and coalitions against outside enemies, or history of breached treaties, disloyalty and treason, on the other hand. That is one approach to how trust and distrust is built. But there is another one. Another approach puts emphasis on building from above a secure or insecure environment for the mutual relationships. Building trust or distrust purposefully from above by shaping context in which parties, be it individuals or groups, operate. Now, this second approach may be called context-rooted trust or distrust. How and when such trust or distrust appears? First of all, the crucial factor is order and predictability by a rule of law, or the opposite, anarchy and arbitrariness of law and law enforcement. Second element of this building from above is efficient and transparent administration, or weak and secretive rule. The third, which has recently been emphasized by my Swedish colleague Apostolis Papakostas, is what he calls civilized public sphere. And he defines it as the social conditions and mechanisms that make actors, institutions and organizations act and perform in a civilized manner in a public sphere. The opposite of that is a decay of moral bonds in the public sphere, bonds of solidarity, of reciprocity, of sympathy, and everyday civility. That relates very closely to what was said before about human dignity as a crucial value for what could be called, after Apostolis, civilized public sphere. Also, perhaps less important, but sometimes quite interesting factor of building aesthetic frame of everyday life. The fact of cleanliness, neatness, light as opposed to dirt, decay, disorder and darkness. We know pretty well from everyday experience that we feel much more secure if this kind of environment is around than if we get into, say, some slum area with graffiti on the walls, dirty and very disheveled people. So that is the second approach, building trust or distrust by shaping external environment in a certain way. Those two approaches are not exclusive. They, in fact, are complementary. They add to each other. Now, building of trust or of distrust depends very much on the starting point. Sometimes it is only the question of extending, deepening of trust or of distrust already existing. For example, trust in a long-time friend, distrust in a long-standing enemy. Another variety is ad hoc building of trust or distrust toward strangers, toward people or institutions about which we don't know much, about reputation of which we don't know anything, on the basis of what is sometimes called first impressions, emotional trust. The third possibility is very difficult, namely reversing the vector of trust. If you start from trust and turn it into distrust, it is relatively easy. We know pretty well that trust is very fragile, that it is enough to see one case of breaching of trust in interpersonal relations that whole trust collapses very quickly. But the opposite situation is much more complex, namely rebuilding trust in the situation of existing distrust, existing conflict, regaining trust in the other party defined as the enemy. This is the most important challenge, and I will focus the rest of my talk on this particular case. But just a very brief conceptual clarification about trust and distrust. It was done already, but I have to repeat some points. Namely, trust and distrust appears in the context of uncertainty. Uncertainty about the future actions of other people or institutions or whole groups. Uncertainty. Niklas Luhmann, who started the big wave of research on trust and distrust and similar phenomena, soft variables of social life, has put emphasis on that already in the 1970s, on uncertainty. I like to use a very simple phrase. Trust is a bet about the future uncertain actions of other people or other collective entities like governments, like regimes even, like groups. A bet about the future contingent action. Trust is an optimistic bet. I bet that those actions will be beneficial, meet my expectations. Trust is a bridge over the sea of uncertainty. In the case of distrust, it is a pessimistic bet. A bet that those actions will be harmful to me, disappoint my expectations, produce all kind of wrong, unexpected things to me. Distrust is here a wall against the threat of uncertainty. Whereas trust is a bridge over the sea of uncertainty, distrust is a wall against the threat of uncertainty. Why I use this concept of a bet? Because trust is more than sheer belief about somebody or about the government or about the party in the conflict. Trust is acting on that belief. Trust is an element of action. It involves commitment of some sort based on belief, on confidence or on suspicion. Taking action against a partner or toward a partner based on my good expectations about him or her or the group. I trust a woman by marrying her means that I believe in her trustworthiness in many respects, and I commit myself. So the belief itself is not yet trust. It is purely mental consideration. I would use the word confidence for that, perhaps. Now, let me be more analytic about it. What kind of beliefs are involved in the condition of distrust? What is the content of those beliefs? Those beliefs about the partner which say that he or she is untrustworthy. What kind of beliefs? There is a scale, I think. First of all, a rather innocuous idea that the partner is incompetent or the party is irrational, that it is intellectually weak. But there may be more expectations about moral issues, dishonesty, lying, unfairness, about moral decay of a certain community with which to which I relate. There may be even more grave idea, namely that the partner is completely indifferent to my interests, to my values, unconcerned with my problems, would refuse any help if I need one. And finally, there is also the expectation of exploitation, egoism, self-centered actions, focused only on individual and egoistic gain at the expense of my own interests. There is a certain scale of beliefs, more or less important. Think about one example just to understand that idea. If you enter a taxi, you are really interested only in the competence of the driver. You are not interested about the moral quality of his family relations or his honesty. Or if you go to a medical doctor, there is much more involved. You don't only expect honesty, but you also expect care. And care is something more. It is taking your interest into account. So there is a scale of those expectations. Those expectations may also be very serious or less serious. If you think about distrust, it may be very serious if it takes this quality of paranoid distrust, insulated to any contrary arguments and particularly resistant to any improvement. It is usually the case when distrust is rooted in religious differences, ideological differences, primordial nationalism or similar forces, which are not easily or sometimes whatever, they are completely indifferent to any rational argumentation. But there are also weaker forms of distrust, skepticism. Skepticism, which in fact which was mentioned earlier today, is quite important element of democracy. Skepticism is an important element of a regime which puts so much emphasis on the mutual balance of forces, on the control, on accountability, on the rule of law, and other elements which prove some level of distrust, but not paranoid, not very strong level, just an assumption which was already to be found in the American Constitution and especially in the debates preceding American Constitution, that there must be some sort of initial skepticism which must be taken care of by the institutions of democracy. Now, moving from this level of beliefs in distrust to the level of actions, to this commitment on the basis of distrust, there is another scale which I would suggest to you. It depends on how the target of our distrust is presented, conceived. The most dangerous moment is when this target is considered as inhuman monster, because then we lose this human tendency to think about the enemy as human. And that's much easier, of course, to deal with the inhuman world if we get to the level of genocide, murder, extermination, and other awful ways to deal with enemies. Zygmunt Bauman has argued, I think very rightly, that the basis of Holocaust was the dehumanization of the Jewish people by the Nazi ideologists, which made this horrendous action easier for the murderers. But there is another step in this scale when we simply think of another as enemy, not as an inhuman, but as a human enemy which must be defeated, harmed, destroyed, weakened, disarmed. A lower level, the third level, is to think about the enemy or the person in a conflict or a group in a conflict as alien, accepted to live, but to live in a separate territory, isolated, segregated. Here, ethnic cleansing, ghettoization, all other measures which move toward isolating the distrusted without destroying them, in fact. And the fourth element in this scale is the idea of a stranger, which is at the basis of multiculturalism, namely somebody who is different from us, But we accept this difference. We don't want particularly to imitate that difference, to learn from that difference, but we have this live and let live attitude toward others who are different from us. We don't want to destroy them, we don't want to eliminate them. We even don't separate ourselves very much, even though we are somehow grudgingly accepting the reality of common existence. Now, how trust and distrust emerges, if we analyze the content of trust and distrust, how it emerges. Very simply speaking, there are three ways in which we build trust or distrust. One, which is based on reason, and that was mentioned before. Namely, we think about the possible motivations or interests of the party, and on this basis we give trust or distrust if we think that the motivations are good for us or not, or harmful. But there are also other cues which we take into account in this calculus of trust or distrust, and I count several of them. One of them is reputation, namely history of earlier deeds, experiences. Second is credentials, second-hand evidence and recommendations, direct or indirect, sometimes symbolic, by people whom we trust, or authorities whom we trust, or third parties whom we trust. Then there are simply external signs of trustworthiness, like appearance or distrustworthiness, in appearance, in external looks, in performance. Those are the cues which we rationally may take into account. But trust and distrust is not only built on such rational grounds. It is sometimes built on emotional and psychological tendencies which we simply acquire of being trustful or suspiciousness from earlier education, socialization, the family, etc. I am particularly concerned with the third leg on which trust or distrust rests, namely culture, cultural features. Well, we have some metaphors to get at that, like social climate, which is trustful or not, social atmosphere in the team or in the high morale in the army, etc. Those cultural factors mean that some tendency to distrust or trust, for that matter, is culturally accepted as proper, which is constrained, which is widely shared, and therefore everybody feels its impact, its pressing force. It happens under several conditions. I don't have time to list them. Conditions of anomie, as Durkheim has put it, conditions of instability of social situations, lack of accountability of actions, lack of external institutions which control and take care of actions, several other features which I tried to describe in my work about how culture of distrust appears, culture of cynicism, culture of distrust. Now, what kind of strategies can be taken to restore trust, starting from the condition of distrust? As I already mentioned, distrust is harder to unlearn than to build slowly trust. Russell Hardin, an American political scientist, puts it in this way: distrust is much harder to unlearn when conditions change to justify trust than is trust when conditions change to justify distrust. There is this asymmetric relation here. But how can we think about rebuilding trust in the conditions of distrust? There are two approaches and two strategies. One is targeting on the relationship itself, how to build the relationship. Another on the context, how to improve this external context, referring to the point I made at the beginning. Those two approaches, trust as cumulatively built in the relationship or trust imposed by the conducive external structure of constraints, of accountability, of the rule of law, of some common interests, some common values, as was mentioned before. The other different approaches may either focus on the conflicting parties or refer to the third party. And I would particularly want, in the short time I have, to say a word about the third party role in resolving conflict. I have to skip the part which discusses how trust may be slowly built in the relationship itself, in the conflict relation, but how the third parties may be invoked. First of all, we may resort to third parties which have some legitimacy, authority or power recognized by both conflicting parties, be them international organizations, institutions of regional integration, hegemonic powers, famous leaders. And that involvement may take two forms. Again, returning to my main argument of those double ways to deal with distrust. First is mediation, and the second is reshaping the context. The role of the third party in mediation would be, for example, clarifying some misperceptions and stereotypes by fact-oriented arguments, certifying trustworthiness of both parties in certain respects, introducing that different perspective. It may also be done by showing, demonstrating some common interests in stopping hostilities and raising costs of their escalation. That was, I think, part of the argument by Shlomo Avineri when he was speaking about the treaties and the finding of the common interest in stopping hostilities. The third possibility is promoting some higher level values, and that was again mentioned in another presentation before, namely finding the common values. Those values like human rights, like human dignity, like general honesty or human drives which we think are natural human features, only replaced by improper social arrangements, social conditions, and somehow kept under control. But very important way in which mediation may work here in the immediate intergroup or interpersonal relations is fragmenting the contested issues, showing that conflict is not overall, but cutting it down into small pieces. That's the only moment when I want to refer to the experience of empirical, historical experience of my own country. The way we got out from communism in 1989 was to sit at the round table together with the opposite, meaning the Communist Party and the social movement. But there were not general discussions. There were a number of sub-tables where small issues were discussed by the opposing parties and some agreement reached, which was later reported to the big round table, and that was pushing the things forward, because that was a pragmatic attempt to eliminate the main ideological issues, which are very hard to combine or to find any consensus about. When it was so fragmented, it helped very much. So mediation may be very, very helpful, and also the fact that the leader of the round table was highly recognized by both parties. He was a scholar, a historian of a high ranking, not involved neither in the party nor in the Solidarność movement. That was also a very helpful strategy, practical strategy. And finally, the mediators may also be important in reshaping the context, not in directly dealing with the conflict, but reshaping the context by, for example, raising the accountability and responsibility of both parties by embracing them by common regime of rules and role enforcements. For example, think about the case of German-French hostilities when they became embraced by the European Union and by wider agreement starting after World War II. A larger set of rules within which those are involved. Then facilitating some mobility between conflicting communities, building some little bridges if possible, allowing flows and mobility through the boundaries. The worst thing are strong boundaries in the situation of conflict. Then the third possibility, providing opportunities for attractive common ventures, profitable trade in some small area, for example, or sport events and competitions. You may remember how Chinese-American reconciliation started with ping-pong teams going both ways, and that was famous ping-pong diplomacy at that time long ago. Then there may be art festivals, regional folk markets, many things which will bring people together in small areas to show that they are similarly human. Guaranteeing the stability of the situation by some sort of external force, even if necessary, by the threat of external intervention if necessary. Revitalizing and aesthetically improving the environment. It is much easier to be trustful toward people when you go to a beautiful park than if you go to a desolate street or dirty environment. And finally, the very crucial thing is to make all these policies I mentioned as much transparent as possible. Secrecy kills trust. Secrecy in all respects is very much against trust. Transparency is one of the crucial features to build slowly the culture of trust, this environment of meanings, beliefs, ideas, which tell you that other people are not necessarily enemies, that they have their human faces, that they have their interests which may be common, etc. So, even though there is evidence that the barriers to trust are difficult to surmount, they are not insurmountable. The knot of distrust, if not untied completely, can at least be loosened. Optimism in this regard, as optimism in general, may have a self-fulfilling impact, mobilizing the search for trust-building measures and, in effect, attenuating the conflict. There is no alternative, because the alternative is hopelessness and despair. Thank you.